This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And we are delighted today to have two gentlemen join us, Julius Krein and Aaron Renn. Julius is the founder and editor of American Affairs, and Aaron is a contributing editor to City Journal and a former senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Joel, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. What we really want to deal with today is the whole issue of what seems to be sort of a madness that has infected our, if you will, ruling class, or it's our putative ruling class. It's a moral decline, it's an economic decline, and it's in many ways a political decline in which the people that we would think would be leading society forward seem to be essentially participating in the deindustrialization of the country and its demoralization. At least that's the way it looks to me. Julius, you worked as an investment banker right before you got into our dishonest business.
That's correct.
Do you think that that Wall Street and the financial community has changed in the years that you've been watching it, become less concerned about the country and more concerned about themselves? What are you seeing?
Well, the sort of most interesting sociologies of Wall Street, I think, actually go back longer than my own personal experience with the industry. And they tend to focus on a number of things, such as when investment banks converted to publicly traded corporations as opposed to partnerships, where before the partners all actually had liability in the enterprise and were really tied to it financially and culturally in a certain way. After the conversion to a more corporate model, it really became a pure eat what you kill, make as much money as quickly as you can. You pay no price if things go badly afterwards, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of truth to that, though most of those changes happened, in 80s, 90s, that era, which is before my time at least. And then you also have really the larger conversions back in the 70s and 80s away from a kind of large corporate driven nifty 50 model to the early milk and junk bond stuff, which I think, had some positive impacts, but also created a much more short-term culture, in addition to the other changes in the US economy more generally, and the reorganizations that happened, moving away from a more kind of corporatist, static, large company, Fordist model to the private equity, more financialized model. But to answer your question directly, in my era, shall we say, I noticed a couple of things. One, you actually had the changes that occurred in the investment banks actually also began occurring in private equity funds. So Blackstone, KKR, Apollo, all became public corporations as well, all became much larger. And I think all actually private equity itself moved into a much more kind of static and repetitive sort of model. It was no longer the dynamic thing it was in the 80s. Now, actually, there was an established hierarchy within the private equity firms. The best firms always got the best opportunities and the best deals, but were also much more limited in their opportunity set to very large companies. And you had a much more recycling among the private equity firms. So they buy one portfolio company, put a bunch of debt on it, sell it to another. Maybe there's a bankruptcy in there and a restructuring. The process basically just repeats and repeats. And those models generally tend to starve businesses of investment very quickly. The other thing I've seen is a rapid decline in the significance of active management and the success of active management. Index funds and so on, high frequency trading, much more the model of the future, or at least the present. The idea of people going out picking stocks, very hard for them, whether at the hedge fund level or the mutual fund level recently, to frankly justify their fees. They just haven't had the performance. And the old sort of value methodologies and a lot of that no longer works anymore. And it hasn't for some time. And I could go on for a long time about why I think that is. But the fact of the matter, as a result of these changes, it's just you have a lot fewer people actually looking to understand businesses, looking to do long-term investments in businesses, and that sort of thing. Much more a very short-term financial engineering focused model in hedge funds, private equity, etc. And in our previous issue, the spring issue of American Affairs, we also had a long look at the venture capital industry, which has also changed dramatically from its origins in the post-World War II era, as well as from the early 90s, and now also struggles to generate returns and tends to funnel a lot more capital into trend-chasing copycat businesses that have not performed as well either financially or even more glaringly in terms of providing good jobs, advancing technology, the things we think and expect venture capital to do.
So let me ask you and interrupt you for a second, because you're on a very interesting role here. So what you're kind of defining, and you've laid this out in a couple of articles, is the difference between people who work for a living, whether it's professional work or manual labor, but increasingly kind of professional work, and people who are really focused on money, capital gains, and transactional deals for a living. How has this affected the ruling class of the country? And what are you seeing? What are you seeing about that?
That's a large question. I think just to start from the Wall Street perspective, I think a figure like Jamie Dimon at this point, and I would hardly, have, unequivocal praise for Jamie Dimon, but a figure like that now today is a market throwback. And, his career, many winding turns, and he builds Citibank with Sandy Weil, and he's involved in all kinds of, today are old-fashioned kind of commercial credit businesses that I don't think are really, almost are no longer even associated with Wall Street at this point. But those kind of figures are no longer there. And the people that have the most money, tend to have made it in ways, again, very short term and very financial engineering focused, that don't lend themselves to the longer term strategic thinking that, being part of an elite, being part of a policy and political community entails. That's A. And B, I think they're much more fragile in their position, even when they have a lot of money. As they say on Wall Street, it's not what have you done for me, it's what have you done for me lately. And actually, if you look at the carnage that has occurred in hedge funds in the last few years, many big names, many large funds have actually, either disappeared or become family offices, withdrawn, had various forms of kind of public humiliation. And I think that just leads to a very mercenary, very, very, even more self-centered than normal finance outlook, and most importantly to me, a very short-term outlook.
Right. So you're talking about kind of a transactional mindset. And so, and so I'd like to kind of involve Aaron on this discussion. So if we're moving toward an elite that is focused on transactions and very short-term thinking, how does this impact the way we live in regular life, in how we develop cities, how we develop our broader economy, or are these worlds just so completely disconnected that we don't have, we don't have any crossover?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've looked at that more at the state and local level than at the Wall Street or the national level. But certainly during the same time period, we saw a change in the composition of local elites in large metropolitan areas. If you go back to the 1980s, there was still significant bank fragmentation. There was significant regulation that limited bank mergers. Many states still restricted banks to their home county, for example. So most cities had, about 3 large independently owned banks. Again, utilities were by and large locally fragmented. Even retail and department stores were still kind of locally fragmented. So there were a lot of these businesses that were essentially restricted to local markets, that had essentially locally based headquarters and management, and were essentially very tied to the welfare of the communities. If you go back to the 1980s and take a bank like Indiana National Bank here in Indianapolis, which is the second largest bank in town, they were basically limited in the amount of loans they could make by how big the local economy got. And so there was an alignment between the incentives of that bank, which is also very restricted in the kinds of activities it could be, and the growth of the local community. And this is where I think Harvey Molotch came up with this famous city as a growth machine thesis. It was in this era where you had these locally based land elites that were, dependent on the growth of the local market. And these were all operating businesses. Bankers in that era made money off the spread between deposits and loans. So the bank president has got a cash register back at the office that never stops ringing. So when he's playing golf at 3 on a golf course, he's still making money. And what happened was most of these locally based businesses, especially the banks, used to be, and again in the 80s, the president of the biggest bank in town was the mover and shaker in many of these communities. Now the banks are gone, the utilities have been bought out, retail's been bought out. Almost all of the operating businesses that constituted local elites are now gone, or they're essentially branches of faraway locations, or they became so big themselves that they're now essentially national global firms and are no longer tied to the local market. And then what were the fragmented businesses that were left? It was law firms. It was architecture firms. It was construction companies. It was a lot of very transactionally oriented businesses, people who only make money if you're billing hours or doing deals. And so you really saw this massive migration to things like publicly subsidized stadium projects. Any sort of publicly subsidized real estate project is a massive feeding frenzy for all these transactional businesses.
Right. So it spawned kind of a new definition of service economy, professional service economy. Yeah. But you in particular, your former partner at Accenture,
I'm a transaction guy.
But you're a technology-oriented guy. Aren't these trends that we're talking about fueled by scale economics and by the ability of technology to handle that growth in scale? And once you open the Pandora's box of technology, is there any way we could actually go back to kind of locally driven, locally controlled economies?
I think it's pretty clear that the main driver of it was regulatory. I mean, if you go back, we deliberately fragmented and regulated these businesses, and the changes that kicked this off were driven by deregulation. Elimination of bank branching laws to allow cross-county banks, eliminations on limits on the share of deposits that could be held by any one bank, limitations on the number of TV stations a media company can own, limitations on owning a TV station and a newspaper in the same market, Glass-Steagall, on down the line. Yes, there is a scenario now where in order to invest in technology, in order to be a bank and to offer your customers, all the technology that they have, you do have to have a certain scale to invest in technology. I don't want to say technology played no role in it, but this really started prior to the era of the real technology revolution. So I think it was primarily, my take was it's primarily regulatory in nature, started in the Carter administration, certainly through to the Reagan administration, where we deliberately privileged these sorts of businesses, particularly finance became very privileged. And you can just, was written about at the time. And, so that's what really, I would say it was primarily a public policy choice. Yes, just like globalization. Yes, there were some forces leading to globalization, like information technology, containerization, fall of the Soviet Union. But we also made specific pro-globalization policy choices. NAFTA was a political choice. The Uruguay round of trade talks was a political choice. China admission to the WTO was a political choice. So I think we have to be clear about the role of public policy choices.
Well, I just want to, take that. First of all, your analysis of local business, I see all the time whenever I'm speaking to a chamber or, here in Los Angeles. It's really, you end up at a meeting of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce and virtually no one owns a real business. I mean, they're lawyers, they have those priorities, and that affects local politics. But Julius, I know, and Aaron, I'd be interested in your views too. Now we have these national companies, but they don't seem to be particularly concerned about the nation. I mean, their scale is huge, but they seem to be much less involved with and even concerned about what's going on to the U.S., competition with China. Do you see this as either of you as a danger if the wealthiest, most powerful, influential people don't actually really much care about the state of the country?
Well, it's certainly, I think it's a huge problem. And of course, the roots of this go back deeper as well. I mean, I would say we're starting to see the end of this, hopefully, but certainly for the last 10 to 20 years, maybe a little bit longer, go ask any sort of S&P 500 company, CFO, CEO, what's your strategy? You almost invariably get, we're going to offshore this function, send it to China, and we're going to take the money and do more share buybacks. In some other cases, you got, well, we're going to sell more to China or to the emerging world. That's our strategy. That was more for the tech companies in particular. But the reliance on offshoring and particularly minimizing costs due to offshoring in order to increase shareholder returns was the leading driver of the U.S. economy for decades. And, one can argue about causation or whatever, but the extent to which the whole globalization ideology, political ideology grew up around that and supported that and how they mutually reinforced each other. There's no question that was a big part of it. And so the fact that today you have a whole business class and leadership class who largely owes their wealth and their positions to things like offshoring, and which has been brought up with and often promoted the sort of ideology of globalization, it's not terribly surprising in my opinion.
Are you at all surprised by the Biden administration's move to change capital gains treatment, the rate on capital gains?
I am somewhat surprised. I would say on the whole, at least at a big picture level, I've been very positively surprised by the Biden administration so far. I would say I would generally be in favor of increasing taxes on capital gains, in part because that's where most of the massive asset price inflation has happened. And that's the natural place to attempt to claw it back. But even more on the Buy American stuff and Build Back Better stuff, and one can get into all the details, and I'm maybe more critical on the details. But big picture wise, I found it very interesting. And I think the Biden administration has actually done this often despite the kind of corporate lobbies and that wing of the Democratic Party. So it feels to me that they there are people that genuinely believe it from a policy standpoint. And also, I think Trump did send a shock through the whole system that we have to get serious about this at some level, or we will just keep losing. But yeah, I was somewhat surprised by it because I don't think it has much of a corporate lobby support, but I think it's a positive thing.
And Aaron, this is kind of a touch point between you and Julius, because the if we end up with more tax revenue coming in from capital gains, the recycling of that and the move to undo the outsourcing and the move to reshore industry is likely to impact the Midwest quite a bit, which is what your area of focus is. Are people talking about that in your world?
Yeah, a lot of people in the Midwest like to think about the opportunities of reshoring. I will find it interesting to see what actually happens there, how much actually does get reshored. But I think what we'll see is the economic geography of industrial expansion is probably going to continue to favor the places that are growing now. Where are the new chip fabs in the United States being built? They're being built in Phoenix. They're not being built in the Midwest. The demographic characteristics of the Midwest are very bad. There's a lot of problems, in these places. And so they're largely being bypassed, I think, by a lot of the industrial development. The place where, manufacturing is setting up shop is in Texas, right? I find it interesting that Elon Musk is setting up his gigafactory in Texas, in Austin, Texas, even, which you think of as a very white collar place. So yes, there's some auto manufacturing in the Midwest. Yes, there's a lot of distribution there. There's going to be some industrial gains there, but I think it's just like immigration. If you think that you'll repopulate Detroit with immigrants, what's going to happen if we doubled the number of immigrants to the United States? Why are any of them going to go to Detroit? They're going to keep going to the places where they're going. And I think it's similar for that. And that's the real, that's the real challenge, I think, with all of these sort of macro level industrial policies from a local geography perspective, is that they will probably tend towards, reinforcing existing trends, rather than reversing them. But
rather than a complete redistribution of either wealth or economic activity.
Yeah, certainly nothing like that has happened to date. I've been a big critic of the Republican leadership in the state of Indiana, where I live. They've pulled, somebody was telling me the other day, I used to work in state government. We pulled every free market lever that we knew how to pull. We cut taxes, we cut regulations, we've done everything. And, the businesses are not exactly pouring in here. Their boast is that they're better than Illinois. And some of that's really out of their control. But I do think, Texas is the place a lot of people are going, Arizona, Phoenix, Utah, Tennessee. So those are the places that are probably going to be the big winners, in any sort of reshoring. I do think, there is a sort of a sea change in the, the way the national elites, view some of these trade deals. I think that basically you see with Trump's tougher line on China. I said this, before the 2020 election. That's one thing that's not going to be rolled back. If there's one thing they're going to keep, it's going to harder line on China, because now that they've got theirs through outsourcing, there's nothing left to gain by further selling out America to line their own pockets. They need to focus on preserving what they've already gotten from China, moving up the value chain and displacing them. So they're now pivoting to a tougher on China stance. But I think it's because they've essentially, exhausted many of the possibilities for, some of this reshoring, which, again, having worked in that business, I can tell you, I personally was, told you need to move jobs from this low cost country to an even lower cost country. I think now, we're kind of at the end of that game a little bit. And so people's ideas are changing.
Do you agree with that, Julius?
I basically agree with that. If you get very detailed, you'll find little pockets here and there where you still see the kind of older view, offshore as fast as possible prevailing. But yeah, I think, we have reached the end of it. There's still kind of an ideological hangover, I think. But the underlying business trends, I believe, are going in different directions. And To the extent there is energy going into that, a lot of it seems to be like, how do I get from China to Vietnam or something like that? It has, and that is also, I think, it remains an issue. I mean, the positive agenda for bringing things back to the United States, much less the other positive agenda of actually reviving the most oppressed regions and so forth. Those are still very much missing. But the idea that China is the future, or at least the future of reshoring and offshoring and that sort of thing, that is definitely evident.
One of the things that I find particularly puzzling in this time has been the embrace by large corporations of groups like Black Lives Matter, which are founded by people who, let's put it this way, are probably more likely to think that they belong in a guillotine than having than being celebrated. What's happened, and why do we have this situation where, in a funny way, the corporate elite has become part of the progressive left? Or is this just a feint or something just to buy time so that Black Lives Matter and people like it will disappear? What's your take on that?
Well, why they've, I won't speculate on why they've embraced certain causes, but the fact that they're able to embrace certain causes, I see is related to, again, some of these trends that have now reached an advanced point. So some kind of cartelization of most industries. Once you have de facto cartelization in an industry, the kinds of market discipline that you expect to be imposed on companies that stray away from making money in order to, grandstand on politics or grandstand on this or that, goes away. There's very little market discipline on a lot of these companies. I think that's one. A lot of them, like I look at like professional sports, I think is a great example of that. I just saw a headline that the PGA Championship outdrew the NBA, outdrew some of the NBA playoff games in terms of ratings.
Wow.
But it doesn't matter. The ratings are down for the NFL significantly, and yet they just signed another record TV deal. So they make all their money off these TV deals. The cable companies get their money off of subscriber fees. They don't really need anybody to watch. So in a lot of ways, yes, there's some trends out there that that aren't perfect. But I think that in a lot of ways, like pro sports, they don't actually need anyone to show up at their games to make a lot of money at some level. And so there's a sense in which we become divorced from economic reality because of cartelization and some of these things. Media, cartelization of a media is another one. A second one is, again, the technologization, if you want to call it that, of many of these businesses. If you look at a company like Google, what percentage of Google's employees actually do anything in the company that's strategic or necessary to their business, right? Very few. I think Peter Thiel pointed out, look, Google is a search ad monopoly. Other than the people who are working on search ads and search engines, which aren't that many people, most of the people who work for Google are sort of doing make work and to a great extent. And so when you have, very few truly strategic employees, cartelization of markets, you also have the legitimate fact that for geostrategic competition purposes, we actually do need these companies to be very large. A nation of small businesses is not viable in a modern globalized world. This is something that James Burnham understood well when he saw that the world was going to go towards blocks as opposed to even the nation state. You had to be part of a transnational block. And so this idea that, we're going to dismantle all of our tech companies and then try to tag on, China is just not going to work. So there are a lot of factors out there that have enabled businesses to do things today, probably decline of political competition among the elite, maybe another one, that they could not do before. And so exactly how that manifests itself, maybe a topic Julius has some thoughts on, but I think cartelization especially lets businesses do things today that they could never get away with before.
Just because I would like to get Julius's take, but just as somebody who covered Hollywood, lived in LA for 40 years, and I still live 15 minutes away from LA County. So, but the reality is that in the past, like, I don't know if anybody watched the Academy Awards. This is Academy Awards in the old days, that was the ultimate event of the entire year here in Southern California. I mean, the one they had now not only had a tiny audience, but it was like a Teacher of the Year award. I mean, it was just a joke.
Yeah,
And
but they're
so,
still printing money. And that's the
Right.
thing. They
well,
don't
but I
need
think part
money to
of it
watch
is,
the Oscars or watch their movies to make money.
Right. The
and so
business
when
model,
Amazon,
the business model underlying Hollywood has changed, and technology has enabled that
yes,
to a great degree. But this kind of brings down this bigger question of the kind of titanic shift that's coming from the generational changes, right? We've got, I mean, Julius has written about the gerontocracy, that is kind of
is that us,
makes up the
Marshall?
elite, that makes up the elite and defines Joel and I in the world. Are we seeing the next generation, the Julius and Aaron generation, stepping up to remake society, undo some of the cartelization, or bring it whatever natural evolution is going to be happening, bring the next mutant strain forward?
I would say we're not seeing it yet. There are, massive differences between the generations, and I never actually cared much for generational analysis. I thought it was, some kind of weird pop psychology thing. But it's impossible to ignore. And it's kind of boomers versus everybody else. But the boomers are the largest and the most powerful. And so even though, I saw the best statistic I saw recently was, it was like a poll of Republican voters or something. And, it was like, does the state need to take a bigger role in managing the economy? And, Republicans under 50, it was 70-30 yes, over 50, 70-30 no. And you can go through a lot of the generational differences. They are that pronounced. But I would say that's another, but boomers, in academia, in corporate management, politics, as we've seen, the last 4 presidents, I think, were born on or before 1946. The boomers are still there. They're still the most powerful. The next generations haven't really taken over. But that is one driver among many, I think, of a lot of the so-called woke capital, or whatever you want to call it. Is one way to get people out is to show how their views are antiquated or racist or whatever.
Great.
That's one of the only ways to actually push out people and clear space. I think the generational stuff drives a lot of what we're seeing today.
But isn't it ironic that the boomer generation is statistically significantly more vaccinated than the younger generation? So if you think about who's gonna survive and who isn't, it's kind of an oddity of modern medicine.
Yeah, but I think that there is also, I think, this issue of kind of a lack of a moral compass. I was, whether it's, I'm an American business, do I care about America? I mean, you get the sense that, and of course, if they've been sufficiently educated in the re-education camps, I mean, the universities, they're going to have anti-Americanism in their DNA. So, but what I find really interesting is this sort of moral decay. Other words, I mean, I've been watching with some interest both Bezos and even more so Gates being outed for, pretty terrible behavior, but particularly Gates. Is there something wrong with our ruling class? I mean, Aaron, you wrote about Baltzell. He happened to have been my brother's professor at Penn. Digby Baltzell, who wrote about it. Do we not? I mean, when I listen to whether it's World War II or the Civil War or certainly the Revolution, the sense of obligation on the part of the wealthy to lead society and to help in a positive way seems to have almost completely disappeared in this search for some sort of personal self-satisfaction. People are unable to be loyal to not only to their country or their community, but even to their own families. That's hopefully that's a provocative thing to talk about.
Yeah, so you alluded to this article I wrote for American Affairs on the
Yes.
sociologist E. Digby Baltzell, who popularized the term WASP for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He was the leading American scholar of the upper class. And he wrote a lot about the decline, the nature of the American establishment in the era when we had sort of a Protestant establishment and its downfall and the implications of that downfall. And he definitely was a critic of that establishment for being overly exclusive. They didn't let in the Jews, they didn't let in Catholics, certainly weren't going to let in any blacks, and yet he said, look, if this establishment goes away, then it's going to have negative social effects. And one of them was that when you have an establishment, which he defined as members of a social upper class who dominate the elite positions in the key domains of society, such as politics, business, the arts, sciences, universities, etc., then the social codes, the behavioral codes of the upper class are normative in society and aspirational in society. And these go back to some of the aristocratic notions of Victorian England, and like what it meant to be a gentleman in the Anglo-American world, for example. And there was a high degree of identification of those upper class establishment people with the nation as a whole. And they did, the essentially inherited wealth, inherited position did come with a sense of expectation and certainly a social code. This was not a huge group of people, right? A lot of them knew each other. They had grown up together. They were intermarried. They vacationed with each other on Martha's Vineyard. And because they were a genuine social community, sort of like, say, a fraternity, it had social rules and expectations. And if you violated them, you sort of get, marginalized or ostracized within that society. Because there's only one upper class, that would be socially painful. So one of the things that happened when that class went away from leadership in America is that the expectations that were there around things like, moral integrity kind of went away. So, for example, they were very big frowned on divorce. The WASP very heavily frowned on divorce. There were certainly philanderers in that group, to be sure, but many of them, kind of were, faithful to their wives and had this sort of almost patriarchal family ethos. And Baltzell, I think, made this, I think, key observation in the 1970s. He says, all of the moral expectations on our leaders have gone away. And now we have ideological expectations. And he goes, and this was going to study, he's like, it's far worse today to be known as an anti-Semite than it is to be known as an adulterer or a consummate liar. And then in essence, I think that captures so much of our society. The only taboos in our society are ideological taboos. If you say the wrong word or you violate the wrong thing, you're out. But if you're a thief, if you're a liar, if you're greedy, if you're looting the country, you can remain in very high social standing in America. And that is, I think, one of the things Baltzell would have said was an implication of the decline and fall of that establishment, that the moral codes and social norms essentially disappeared from the leadership class.
I was just wondering, Julius, you're in New England, which is sort of the historic center of American Brahmanism. Have things changed? You're a native of New England, or?
I'm originally from South Dakota, so I make no commentary on New England sociology. But since Aaron so ably wrote the Baltzell piece and just summarized it, I'll plug two other articles in American Affairs on this question in the latest issue. The first is by a Brazilian writer, and the title is The Brazilianization of the World. And it's a long article, but the one key point of it is basically that, from the Brazilian perspective, and maybe most of history's perspective, elites are always selling out their country to preserve their own status. That's the norm. And maybe America was exceptional because we had an elite that actually tried once in a while. But maybe we're reverting to the mean. The other one is a review of this Montreal filmmaker Denis Arcand's films, going back to the 80s. They're The Decline of the American Empire in 1986, the Barbarian Invasions, Age of Darkness, and The Fall of the American Empire. And I won't go through all of it, but essentially the point there was that actually the problems of the academics in the 80s, the ennui, the nihilism, relativism, the sort of disregard of conventional morality, all these seeming pathologies, had gone from an elite intellectual preoccupation to kind of mainstream bourgeois businessmen, were all of a sudden faced with these questions over time. This is kind of the driving force. And the last thing I'll say is a kind of an economic addition to it, which is when you have an economy that is financialized and you don't actually have real productivity gains and you just have asset price inflation, you end up with a situation, it creates extreme elite precarity. Because, for example, even now in the midst of the pandemic, you can go to New York and spend $100 million on basically a box apartment. And it has a nice view and it's in a fashionable building. But you have a lot of money, but it doesn't actually buy that much in terms of, say, prestige real estate and these other key status objects. And that creates this extreme sense of weakness and competitiveness, I think. And you see a lot of pathologies like that just arising out of the weaknesses that came from having this totally unproductive financialized economy that feeds on itself and reinforces
I really like the fact that you put these things together, both of you. I mean, it's really, very useful, because I think that one of the things that I totally agree with the idea that what I see is a country, 20 years from now, and maybe we'll just, sort of look at the future, which looks, I don't know if any of you, there was a book that Stanley Bing wrote about, called Immortal Life, about a world where within 20 years, the world is controlled by 10 tech companies, basically. The national government no longer really exists. And the big obsession of all these people, there are great scenes where all the companies are meeting, and Cook is like 90 years old, and his biggest concern is how does he live forever?
Sounds like something to Redstone.
Yes, right, that kind of thing. So, the question is, where are we going? Do you think that there's a chance that we'll go back to something that's more sort of positive for the working class, for the middle class, for the country, or are we just headed towards this globalized dystopia? I love the Brazil analogy as really very relevant. Here in Southern California, we're probably further along towards Brazilianization than most of the country. But where do you see the future going? Are we headed in the direction that's going to lead us to Brazil, or are we headed to a better direction? And just like to get your last thoughts on that.
I don't know, is the honest answer. I do think intellectually, there's positive signs. You see a lot of energy. Even politically, I think you find many politicians get this. What makes me pessimistic is that the sort of billionaire class and the business class is the most resistant to it. And in America, at least, without that, it's very hard to get anywhere. So it doesn't seem to have, much of a material base yet. The other part of it, though, is kind of the China question, and exactly which direction that pushes the elite to go. And maybe to come full circle on the finance stuff, the U.S. strategy in the post-Cold War world has, it's been a maximize IRR strategy. Invest less in order to maximize the returns on the investments you do make. China has essentially done the opposite. Invest as much as possible. As long as you get some return, that's fine. And I do wonder if, that latter view is the developmentalist view, and it's a destabilizing position in a way, and it requires a greater risk on the part of the elite. And so I just wonder whether or not the existing billionaire class will be able to get over that, and whether it'll be, they're going to be willing to take the risks to their position that would be necessary to preserve the whole. And I think that's an open question. And as long as we don't see movement there, it's hard to be terribly optimistic, despite what I think the more positive signs you're seeing in the intellectual and political worlds.
Aaron, you want to?
Yeah, I think if you tried to just look at the trends out there, you wouldn't be totally optimistic about things. But it's always a mistake to just try to linearly extrapolate into the future. There are always radical disruptions, black swans, if you will, that happen. And we also see that history does kind of have a pendulum. You can even look at things like sexual norms, for example. We went from a little more permissive era into the more restrictive Victorian era. Then we went into the 1920s. It was a little more libertinous again. We're back to the 50s. It's a little more conformist. Then you get into the 60s, sexual revolution. So if you look at these differences between, you can look at the same thing in terms of financial regulation. We went for the Gilded Age. Then we had sort of the progressive era, and we've gone through different changes there. In America, we've often gone through different institutional resets every 70 to 80 years. The first one with the founding. Through to the revolution, the Constitution, then after the Civil War, then kind of the New Deal in World War II, and maybe we're due for another one. And so there's no guarantee that things are going to turn out well. And now, America always pulls through. I mean, that's not something we should always say, but I think it's very easy to, convince yourself, terrible things are inevitable. If you go back and look at even the most prescient books, and most insightful books about the world that you go back and read, like Burnham's Managerial Revolution, you see the predictions are just so off base in a lot of ways, and yet many of the core insights are there, but they don't necessarily even develop in a way that we can think. I just use in January 1st, 2015, who would have predicted Donald Trump was going to be the president of the United States? Nobody, not even Donald Trump. Who was going to predict COVID? So there's, I think, keeping a sense of, hope, optimism, and an openness towards the future, and rejecting this idea of historical inevitability that I think, especially the left, has tried to, convince you that there's there's the right side of history. History's on this march, and we know where it's going, and it doesn't always work that way. So I would like to be optimistic that things can work out better in the future. If not, maybe the immediate term.
Well, gentlemen, what a provocative discussion. This is really, really great. Thank you so much. It's going to be fascinating to see how things play out as we move through this, what I personally believe and agree with you on, Aaron, is kind of the shifting of the long cycle, moving into this next 80-year period where who knows what the metrical base will be for measuring it, but it's probably quite a bit different. Whether we get out of this ruthless financial efficiency model and into measuring other kinds of benefits to society and optimizing that, or whether or not we continue down this road is going to be something that will have to play itself out. But I really appreciate the insight that the two of you have brought to the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.